And he says that he brings up this saying of leavened bread. He says a little leaven leavens the whole lump of dough. Now that's lost on our generation, on our society a little bit. But you have to understand that the people back in this day, they would make bread daily, and they would leaven it, and it would rise, and they would bake it. And Paul continues by saying that the old leaven must be purged from the new lump. See, if you remember back in Jewish history, back in Exodus, that great act when God reached down into history in such a way to show the Jewish people His love. Remember back to Exodus, when Moses went to Pharaoh, and you remember, Moses said, "Let my people go," and Pharaoh said, "Okay," and then he relented. He said, "Never mind." So Moses said, "All right," and he said, "I'm going to throw some locusts your way." And Pharaoh didn't like that, so he said, "Go," and back and forth, all these plagues kept happening until the one plague that Pharaoh couldn't stand anymore, called the Passover. And what the Passover was God sent His Spirit out, and as it went over every household, then it would kill the firstborn son. But when it came to an Israelite household, God had said, "Do this, my people, do this. I want you to kill a perfect lamb. And I want you to take that lamb and put the blood on both sides of the door and put it over the top. And then I want you to take that lamb and cook every part of it and eat it. Leave nothing. And then along with that lamb, you're going to eat unleavened bread." This was what God commanded them to do. And with that, God said, "If you'll do that, when my Spirit comes to take the firstborn, it will pass over your house." So they had this Passover celebration every single year. They would celebrate the Passover that God had spared them because of their faith. This is what Paul makes the analogy of. He says you have to throw out that old way of life. You can't be caught up in that cycle. My mom and dad did this skit when I was growing up. It was when we lived in Oklahoma, so I was probably somewhere around 3 or 4 years old. And the skit's just real good. I don't even remember what the skit's about. I think my mom is trying to teach my dad a magic thing, and it's something with a banana and a bandana and a cup. And my dad plays kind of the goofy character. I think he told me his name was Orpheus Hindergrinder. I don't know where he makes it up, but anyway, I was a real young boy, and they were doing this. They had just, and this is such a strange story, because he had just started pastoring this church, and I don't know why he would do this skit. But my mom's explaining each thing to the crowd, and when it comes to the banana, my mom says, "Now here's the banana, and Orpheus, here's the banana." And what she's trying to get him to do is make the banana disappear. And he sees the banana, and he smashes it. And my mom gets upset, and so they find another banana, and she kind of protects. Well, then it comes to the cup portion of it, and they set the cup, and my mom says, "Now, Orpheus, here's the cup," and she's showing it to the crowd, and he says, "Cup," and he smashes it. Now, the way the skit is supposed to go is that then there's no cup. But I was 4 years old, and I thought it was an accident. And so I said, "Hey, I know where some cups are." And so I run, go grab a cup and bring it back and set it down. And so my mom and dad are kind of looking at one another, and there's a fairly large crowd. So my mom goes kind of back through Orpheus, here's the cup, and he says, "Cup," and he smashes it. And I'm thinking, what, he smashed it? And I said, "Well, I know where a cup is," and I run, go get a cup, and I bring it back. And by this point, the crowd knows what's going on, and they're not stopping me. They think it's funny to watch my folks up there sweat a little bit. Finally, I think at some point somebody, spared them a little mercy and grabbed me. But I would still be going and getting cups today if somebody hadn't grabbed me. It just didn't make sense to me. Why would he smash the cup? I guess I'll go get another one, My dad's acting silly right now. That's the way sin is in our life. It's a cycle that's not supposed to be there. That unconfessed sin, that undealt with sin. in your own life or in this church, if we don't deal with willful sin, it's a continued cycle that's not supposed to happen. And the same is true when Paul says that Jesus is the new Passover. We're no longer in the old cycle. We're no longer like the Jewish people. There's still Jewish people today that every year Passover comes and they're spreading blood on the doorposts and over the top and they're eating unleavened bread. And God says, no more of that. I sent the perfect Passover lamb in my Son. Jesus' blood covering our sin once and for all. Fellowship revolves around Jesus, not around sin. Paul continues in verse 9 and he says that I wrote to you in this letter not to associate with immoral people. He's referring to a letter that we don't have anymore. He's referring to something he wrote to the Corinthians before. But he goes on and he draws a clear line in these last few verses between people in the church and people not in the church. So, this is where it gets really tough. Because what Paul goes on to say is that we don't hold the same principles and rules for those outside of the church as we do for those in the church. He says God will deal with them. But in the church, and this is where it gets a little tricky, in the church he clearly points to the fact that there is supposed to be church discipline. That there is supposed to be this uncomfortable holding up of one another to God's Word. He says in verse 12, "For what do I have with judging outsiders?" Then he goes on to say, "Do you not judge those who are within the church?" We have to be very careful with this. We have to be very careful with this. So when an NBA player comes out of the closet and it becomes a big social buzz, like what happened last week, we don't judge him to our standards. But when I see my brother or my sister actively involved in sin, God calls us to hold one another up. Now, this doesn't mean that we come at one another with a rod, but it's completely out of love. There's a book that came out in 1987 called Beloved. And it's a very, very strange story about a lady named Sethi. And she is a slave right before the Civil War. And in this story, there's a part of it that's difficult to understand because Sethi escapes slavery and makes it to Ohio, a free state. And in the book, it tells about how the masters, her masters, had the ability to go to Ohio and find her. Or there's a real graphic scene in there that kind of sets the tone for the whole book. When the masters come up, that this lady who had her children with her ran out to a woodshed, and she actually killed her youngest daughter. And we think, ooh, why would she do that? Well, we find out more in the story that in her mind, she loved her daughter so much that she couldn't stand to see her go back into slavery. It's a very strange book, and we read that and we have difficulty understanding how bad was slavery that killing your own child was better than that. It's this really strange story that we have a difficult time understanding. It's a strange love that she says she has. And the same thing is true about our church discipline. It's a strange kind of love. When those outside of the church look at it, and even some of those inside of the church look at church discipline, we say, that's not love. That's not love. But it is. Another strange kind of love is, why would Creator God send His Son to die for His creation? It's a strange kind of love. And so when we look at what Paul says about church discipline, it has to come from love.